5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right. All systems go. Hello, willkommen, bienvenue, konnichiwa, ni hao, jambo, marhaba. It's time for the Arms Inquisition yet again, episode 260 on Sunday, the 4th of December. I'm Phil.
I'm Ben.
I'm Matt.
And we got Chris Tolworthy back with us again. Hi, Chris. Nice to see you again.
Hi, thanks for letting me back.
It's a pleasure. You've got so much research in your mind that we want to tap, and the sort of idea behind this podcast was to focus mainly on Atlantis, which is one of my favourite subjects. And it's kind of in vogue with this, incredibly dangerous Netflix series with Graham Hancock. Now then, I've been looking into Atlantis for a few years now, whether it be books or YouTube channels or whatnot. In fact, I got Charles Berlitz's famous book earlier this year in a charity shop, which came out in the early 80s, I think, 84, something like that. And invariably, once you start going down this rabbit hole, most books or YouTube videos on the topic tend to start with the same account as their basis to move forward, and that being Plato's account from Timaeus and Critias. And I believe this sticks in your craw somewhat, Chris.
Oh, it drives me crazy. I was just looking through all the scholars I could find. They all start with stuff like Atlantis is fiction invented by Plato, and Plato invented Atlantis, and Plato did it, and there's nothing before Plato, and blah, blah, blah. It's like the first line. But somehow they feel that's like a religious thing. They've got to say this. And that's garbage. The whole thing was multiple times. It's in well-known Greek documents from before Plato. And it drives me crazy when they say it. I mean, you see why they say it, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Yeah. So I thought I want to get on there and just at least list some of the stories of Atlantis that predate Plato.
Have you any theories as to why Plato seems to always be the starting point? Is it the most detailed account, or is it because of Plato's sort of, renown as a philosopher?
Yeah, I think that's what I think. The problem is you can't bury him. You can't say he's an idiot. Anybody else, you can say, well, that's just their opinion. But with Plato, it's really awkward because the whole of Western civilization says that Plato was very, very clever. He's very accurate. He's just great. You can't diss Plato. And yet here he is telling us about this 9,000-year-old civilization. And it's really awkward.
Yeah. So
you've got to just say, okay, he made it up. You have to just own it and say, okay, he did say it, but he didn't mean it.
Right. A lot of modern... Sorry, Chris, go on.
Oh, so it doesn't matter whether he made it or not. We can construct the entire thing using people from before Plato. You don't need Plato for Atlantis.
This is something that modern scholarship often uses as a cudgel to bash Atlantis. They say, well, Plato's story is an allegory to his life and times about Greece at the time that he was living.
Yeah, I use the example of the Second World War. I wish I could find out. Years and years and years ago, somebody wrote this fantastic essay about, totally tongue-in-cheek, about how the Second World War didn't happen. Because all the names, apparently, like the name of Hitler, the name of Goebbels, the name of this person, that person, they all kind of fit, like as if they're fictional. Like somebody was called Iron, and somebody was called Tank, and somebody's, and it makes a really, really strong case that the Second World War never happened. Now, obviously, it did happen, but if you wanted to, you could make it sound like it was an allegory. Like it never really happened. There's no evidence for it. I mean, you could say it's all contradictions. I mean, it's supposed to be against Germany, and then America said it's against Japan. They made a stupid mistake. Like it's obviously fiction. Now, it isn't fiction, but it's very easy to make truth look like fiction if you don't want to believe it.
Great point.
So I thought the simplest thing, I'm just going to sidestep it entirely. It's not even talk about Plato. Let's talk about the story before Plato and see that this was the best known story. Actually, it probably was the best known story in all world history. I mean, where do you want to start?
Yeah, well, where do we start when it comes to pre-Platonic Atlantis references?
110,000 years ago. I tell you, it's linked to a video I just saw last week. It's brilliant. This is the oldest story that's known to mankind. because it's the same story is told not only in Greece, but in Australia. So they knew it had to be at least 50,000 years old. And it all centers around the seven stars, the Pleiades. The Pleiades or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, the seven sisters. There's only six of them. And every single story about these says there were seven, but one of them disappeared. And that could only have been 100,000 years ago, because the two stars are so close together, you cannot tell them apart with a naked eye, but you could 100,000 years ago. So that places it there. There's other evidence too, that this is a 100,000-year-old story about Orion, the great hunter, and how he was attacking the seven sisters. And every single civilization on Earth, America, Australia, Africa, you name it, has this same story. And this is a story of mankind. And it's basically the story of how we left Africa. This is the Out of Africa story, of how you got these young, excited, macho hunters saying, we want to defeat the planet, we want to defeat the world, we want to defeat all the lands. And then the poor little lands getting defeated. So you got Orion versus the seven sisters. Each of them represents a different land. And that's basically the story of Atlantis. The story of Atlantis is the Out of Africa. I mean, Atlantis just means a daughter of Africa. So a daughter of Atlas. Atlas just meant the mountains at the edge of the world, which they meant as Africa. When you got to Pliny the Younger, who said that Ethiopia, which means the land of the burnt faces, what we call Africa today, was the whole of Africa. It used to be called Atlantia. It's just the land of Atlas, because Atlas was at the edge of the world. They had this view of the world being a dome, and at the edge of the world, there's all these unknown mountains, basically, over the mountains, who knows what's over there. And that's the area they called Atlas. Probably comes from the word Adrar, which is the Berber word for mountain. It was the edge of the world, meant Africa, all the places you came from, the origin places, the land of the dead, just like out there. And whenever they talk about it specifically, they're always talking about Africa, Ethiopia. So yeah, it's the Out of Africa thing. This is a 110,000-year-old story. And sorry?
So you mentioned the Pleiades, about that. That's how you date the story to 110,000 BC, because one of the stars isn't visible now. How did they know it was visible then?
Right, well, you can track the movement of it. Well, I've got powerful telescopes, so you can so there's all these stars you can't even see because they're too far away. But there's 6 stars that makes up Pleiades, and there's actually 7 of them. But on the powerful telescope, you can just about resolve that 2 of them are really, really close together. But the human eye can only see 1 star. But because of the way they've moved over the years, you can work the clock back and realize the stars were separate, and they're further and further apart the further back you go. They used to think you could tell them apart about 50,000 years ago. So they say, okay, when the story is split off to Australia, then they could see it. But they've done more accurate measurements since then, and they reckon, no, it was actually 100,000 years ago. You couldn't really tell them apart until 100,000 years ago. So that really dates it.
And does this tie in with like the sort of modern understanding like of anthropology and, how civilization, is the Out of Africa thing the accepted?
Yeah, 110,000 years ago, we all left Africa. There's several waves. There's another one like 70,000 or 50,000. And there's various ways. 110,000 is a sort of beginning point. And this is why I get so excited about Atlantis, and why it's so important, and why scholars don't want to accept it. Because once you accept Atlantis, you accept that we have reliable records from 10,000 BC that talk about much, much earlier. And it opens up this entire 100,000-year history. It's all written there. It's all written in the stars. What I wanted to talk about today is the examples of the more recent stories of Atlantis, and maybe end with the story how it is in the stars, because the Greek stars is just fascinating. Every detail of the stars, when they rise, where they set, which ones never go below the horizon, what time of the year they appear, what colors they are, how far apart they are, you name it. Everything tells a story. It's amazing. We talk about not having writing before 3000 BC. We have writing in the sky. They have these patterns, and they've interpreted these patterns, and they've attached these patterns, all this meaning to it. And you've got a calendar there, you've got a space, you've got time, you've got characters, you've got events, and every story, you can put a date to it. In fact, I'll rush that a bit. I've got these notes I was writing down, and as usual, I completely just go away from them right from the beginning.
It's okay.
110,000 years, okay. It's the world's oldest story. The story that all the people have there from Australia, America, whatever, is how you've got basically the builder, your young macho guy, your Orion defeating the lands, these ladies who are like the gatherers, the hunter defeating the gatherers. And now there used to be 7 of them, and now there's only 6. And that's what's most important. So that dates at 110,000 BC. Also, you remember the Yazidis I mentioned before, they have records too. They also date the beginning to 110,000 BC. So that's 2 lots of records. And that's when scholars say they left Africa. So they got 110,000 BC. The next big date, you got 10,000 BC. You're the first of the 7 sisters, who are the 7 daughters of Atlas, the 7 daughters of Africa. That is a 70. What's called Electra. Now, Electra, her island, each of them has a particular place. Her island is the island of Mount Sayus on where is that? South Sayus? Anyway, it's the little island next to the Dardanelles. Where Europe joins to Asia. Because mankind, after we left Africa, we settled in Anatolia for quite a long time.
Modern Turkey.
Yeah, modern Turkey, yes. Yeah, because the Neanderthals had taken over further north. They were already in Europe. And so, in the story of the 7 Sisters, you've got the story of how we left Africa and how we then spread out to, in this case, Greece. Yes, I know. Electra is one of them. Her mountain was this little island just by the Dardanelles. So that's when you first left the old world. And so that dates it to about 10,000 BC. This is very much in the time of Göbekli Tepe. That's the place. Now, her son was called Iason. He loved Demeter, who represented agriculture, the goddess of agriculture. So, and that dates it to 8,000 BC, because that's when you get your settled farming. So the story is that she was in Island by the Dardanelles. He had a son who loved agriculture, and then I think it was Zeus said that he can't do this. He can't settle and have agriculture, so he killed him. Luckily, Electra had another son. I think, who is it now? It was the rape of land, basically. Dardanus, that's right. And Dardanus then left. Dardanus said, I'm sick of this. I am leaving the old world. I'm going to go to Europe. And that's where we get the Dardanelles from. Wow. Which is a little gap between Europe and Asia. And it's named after Dardanus, the son of... Anyway. Now, according to the scholars, they left about 6,000 BC. You can actually trace where all the animals were, like animal droppings and skulls and so on, where people were herding animals. So that dates us about 6,000 BC. But also, the Pleiades were called little pigs. And pigs were also domesticated 6,000 BC. So again, so you've got your 110,000 BC, you've got your 10,000, your 8,000, you've got your 6,000 BC. It's all in the story. The next big date was Dardanus' son, Erichthonius. And he was known, according to Homer, as being the wealthiest man alive and having a lot of horses. Now, horses were domesticated about 2000 BC. So you got the idea of them settling further in Europe with horses and money, and it's going really, really well for them. And that's when you have the Atlantis story begins, the Atlantis that we know from Plato. And then Erichthonius' son, Tros, built Troy. Troy is a city of Tros. And that's about 1000 BC. So just this story of Electra, who was one of the daughters of Atlantis, daughters of Atlas. Atlantis just means a daughter of Atlas. The story of Electra, you've got all these dates, 10,000, 8,000, 6,000, 2,000, 1,000 BC, all contained within the story. And I think that's brilliant. That is the way to teach history. And now we can dig up the archaeology and sort of work out and find out they're actually correct. But it's all there in the stars. And that's just Electra. That's just one of the 7 sisters. And they've each got a story like this. You can go through each of the 7 sisters, and you can see what part of Greece they belong to, and how it's a story of how the Greeks, well, the Athenians specifically, gradually came from the old world, from Turkey as it is now, to all the different parts of Greece, and how they settled in these 7 places, and they became the 7 sisters. And they weren't the only daughters of Atlas. The point I want to make also is that there were many daughters of Atlas. There are many Atlantices or Atlantides. So when you have different people saying, no, Atlantis was actually in America, or Atlantis was here, Atlantis is everywhere, basically. I think they're actually right, because this is a pattern. Throughout history, you've had the young men have gone and left and found a new land. The successful ones are good on boats, because that's the only way you travel. So whenever you have a powerful maritime civilization, they tend to have circular harbors. You especially see this in the Phoenicians. The Phoenician capitals like Tyre and Sidon and Carthage, of course, all have their circular harbors. And you can go back in time and you can see how the dominant civilization, the maritime civilization, always had the circular harbors, and they always grew proud, and they always invaded other nations, and they always finally had a catastrophe. So the Atlantis story has been repeated many, many times. So I'm quite happy to say, yes, there was an Atlantis in America, and yes, in Ireland. Yes, because that's just the normal way. You have a circular harbor because it's the easiest way to defend it. This is not it's nature, it's natural. We invade because we're human. We do these things. We grow proud because we're human. It all collapses because pride makes us weak and lazy and take chances, and so on and so on. Everything in the Atlantis story is very specific to a particular example that Plato knew about, but it also was repeated many, many times. And as I specifically would point to Tyre, to Sidon, to Tunisia, to the Eye of Africa, and I'm quite sure throughout the world this has happened many times. So it's not like the different Atlantis people are all enemies and one's wrong and the one's right and all the rest are wrong. I think they're all looking at different Atlantids because there are many, many daughters of Atlantis. Or the other point I'd make is not just the 7 Pleiades, there's also 7 Hyades, which were the ones who were the nursemaids to Dionysus. And Dionysus means Dionysus, which means they came from Nisus, which is the old world. This thing the Hittites call themselves at the Nisus. Dio just means Zeus. It means Zeus from Nisus. Nisus in the old world. The Hyades were the oldest daughters of Atlas, the original ones. And the important thing what they did is that they were nursemaids to Dionysus, who gave us civilization, basically. Particularly gave us alcohol, because alcohol is the basis of civilization. And all the scholars who are any good say this. That's how our ancestors persuaded the hunter-gatherers to stop being hunter-gatherers and become slaves because they got drink and booze, all that drugs. I mean, seriously, that book Against the Grain, it explains why it is we have civilization was based on grain and wasn't based on seafoods or potatoes, because grain is very easy to tax. It's above the ground and it all comes ripe at one time of the year, so the king has to come in and see how much you've got and take your money off you. But the other advantage of grain is that you can make booze from it. And if you look at the Egyptian story, there's the best example of Atlantis. The Egyptian story of Atlantis, it ends with the booze. That's how they solve the problem. They get everybody drunk. And that's how they get them to finally settle down and stop killing each other.
Oh, you have to explain that. Just before you explain the Egyptian story of Atlantis, we got a message from David Stig Hansen. Wanted to say hello.
Hello. Hi, David.
He's been to the recat structure a couple of times, apparently.
Oh, he's fantastic. Oh, I was going to tell him about this. This is wonderful. Yeah, I mean, yeah, he's a great guy,
Is David another researcher in this area?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's actually been there. I mean, I am a classic armchair person. I'm the lazy kind. Right. I just sort of look at it and say, why aren't they talking about this? Whereas David actually goes there.
All right, cool.
You can't beat personal experience. You can't.
Yeah, I'll have to check out. David, send us some links to your stuff or your YouTube channel if you have one, and we can check it out. But you just whet my appetite. You were going to tell us about the Egyptian Atlantis story. Because, I mean, Plato says that he gets the story from Solon, who lived before Plato, and he got it from the Egyptian high priest. So even if you're sticking with Plato, it's an Egyptian story that he's supposedly relating. So what's the Egyptian version?
Well, it's a crazy thing. I mean, why do people say he made it up? Plato himself said, don't believe me, it's written on the walls of the temples. And it's written in multiple places. It's actually quite easy to find. I mean, this is one of the things that makes me think, what are scholars doing? I know what they're doing. They are paid by universities who are paid by the government to train people to be good workers. They do not want anarchists. They do not want hippies. They do not want people who believe in Atlantis. They do not want Marxists. They don't want anybody else. They want good workers. And that's why they got to believe a certain thing. And that's why they teach this. But yeah, Plato said it's on the walls of Egyptian temples. You can go there and find out. They call it the story of the destruction of mankind, also known as the story of the heavenly cow. It's easy to find because the Egyptians didn't tend to...
Heavenly cow?
Yes.
Right, because the Pleiades and the Hyades, they're in the constellation of Taurus.
I hadn't thought of that, yes.
Heavenly
it all fits
cow.
in. Yeah, I'm not an expert at this. What got me was, though, the dating thing. Remember, Plato says it's 9,000 BC, and so many Atlantis people say he must have made a mistake. He must have meant 900 years. I think, no, it doesn't matter if he doesn't say 9,000 years, because he defines it specifically as the start of the Constitution. And he defines the Constitution as a division of labor. He says this is when the Egyptians and the Athenians first had separate jobs for scholars, separate soldiers, separate farmers, separate priests, separate artisans, and so on. And the division of labor began when we had settled farming. So even without the date, we know how to be 9 or 8,000 BC. And the big deal then was when you got cattle farming. And the cow people were the people of Anatolia, the pre-pottery Neolithic. And they were the ones who rescued the Egyptians. But yeah, the story of the destruction of mankind It's on King Tutankhamun's tomb. It's in various other tombs. And that's 1300 BC. So that predates Plato by 1,000 years. And briefly, the story is that long, long ago, right at the beginning of, well, not the beginning, but the beginning of this particular cycle of Egyptian history, Egypt was in a bad way. The gods were sort of weak. Somebody else had taken over, these blasphemers, they called them, had taken over Egypt. And the only way to get rid of them was the people of the cow came and drove them out to the mountains and killed them.
Oh, this isn't Hyksos, is it?
No, this is 9,000 years earlier.
Oh shit! Right, okay, sorry.
But again, it's the pattern. These things happen. You know, whenever people get power, they tend to invade. You overstretch yourself. You become lazy, and you know that's what I'm saying. There are many Atlantises. This particular story that he was talking about is the one that was on the Egyptian tombs. Right. Yeah, and it is about the people of the cow rescuing Egypt. I mean, remember the story of Atlantis is basically that people from the West invaded Egypt. Egypt said, "Help me, help me," and the people of Athens came and rescued them and drove out the Atlantis. So that's the story, and that's the same story on the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb. In that Egypt was in a really, really bad way because of these invaders, and the people of the cow, i.e., the people from Anatolia, i.e., the ancestors of the Athenians, came and rescued them and drove them out. And of course, there was a lot of war there because presumably the people from Anatolia weren't as friendly as the Egyptians are making out. And the Egyptian gods were not as powerful as they were making out. This is their propaganda version. I mean, when they say the gods are weak, you know the gods are defeated. You know that Egypt was in a really bad way. And you can show it archaeologically. You don't need to rely on this. It all tells the same story. But yeah, the people of the cow saved Egypt. And that is the story of Atlantis. And you can say, well, where did they drive them out to? Drove them out to the mountains. Well, they're not going to drive them out to the Egyptian mountains because that's in Egypt and they aren't very big mountains anyway. They're not going to drive them to the Anatolian mountains because that's where the people of the cow came from. So the only mountains nearby are the mountains to the west. And this became known as the Mountains of Death. The ancient Egyptians and the Athenians all saw death as the land of the dead as being over to the west. Because you didn't go there because this is where the powerful people were who were going to kill you. It all tells the same story. So yeah, these are the people of Atlas. The land of the dead is the Atlas Mountains. Because that was the edge of the world as they knew it. And so the idea was that's when the sun goes to set. And when you die, you go over those mountains and you fall down this big pit. And actually, on a tangent there, in the days of Homer, it's actually seen as a good place. It's a very blessed place. It was only later on when the Athenians became more powerful and started to expand and go to the west, then the propaganda said that the people in the west had to be really bad guys. So it's really interesting how the Hades started off as a good place and became a bad place. And if you actually look at the description of Hades, they're basically describing Atlantis. But yeah, the story of the heavenly cow is a story of Atlantis, and it's on the walls of the tombs, just as Plato said. You don't need to trust Plato. I mean, and the main reason, if you remember nothing else about the pre-Plato Atlantis, is that the scholars try to tell us that Atlas the king in Plato and Atlas the man's gone blank. The gods versus the Titans. Atlas, the leader of the Titans. The scholars try to pretend they're two different people, and they're not. All the ancient sources say they're the same person. Atlas the king was Atlas the Titan. So when you're reading about Atlas the Titans, like the Titanomachy, the great war between the gods and the Titans, this was the story of Atlantis. If you're Titanomachy, it began with the people of Atlas taking far too much interest in Egypt. Again, it's the same as in the story of Plato's version of it. And so then the gods decided to drive them out, and they drove them out back to the west, where they came from. Again, it's the same story as Atlantis. Now, the scholars try and say that, well, Atlas the king and Atlas the Titan were two different people. Garbage. You know, again and again and again, all the sources say they were the same person. It's the same story. You know, it's the founding myth of Athens and the founding story of Egypt are the same story. It's the story of Atlantis. The same as a 100,000 years old story that's throughout the world. It's the same story. Sorry, I'm going on and on. Interrupt.
No, I was just letting you go. What? I mean, so are we saying that all these stories relating different events that have happened through history, or is it an echo of the original event that's being retold and made?
Specifically, the original event from 9000 BC. I mean, obviously they're simplifying it. I mean, I would argue that The actual event we're talking about, you could include 10,000 BC because you've got Göbekli Tepe, then you've got the leaving there. 8,700 is where archaeology pinpoints it. And that's the other point. That's the first thing that got me interested in Atlantis. I said, well, instead of saying, well, was he making it up? Let's look at archaeology. And sure enough, the people of the West, people of the Atlas Mountains, traveled east and disappeared from the record 8,700 BC because of the Younger Dryas. And then suddenly the people of Egypt all disappeared. That's the Natufians. And then a few hundred years later, the people of Egypt reappeared, but this time they had weapons. Before that, they never had bows and arrows. But after that, they had bows and arrows. And then after that, the people of the West suddenly reappear in the West again, only slightly further east than they were before. Yeah, so archaeology backs this up. It happened just when Plato said it is. Yeah, the people of the West invaded Egypt, killed everybody in Egypt, got driven back again. And after that, that's when you get the first. I mentioned in my book about history is defined by this great wall of Jericho, the first great wall, the first great tower, the biggest building in the world for 5,000 years, 8,000 BC. And just as Plato said, 8,000 BC is when the Egyptians began their nation. Specifically, is when they start having a division of labor, i.e., when they settled, i.e., when they built this big tower at Jericho. Because Jericho, not Egypt, has always been the whole area, including what we now call Israel, and the whole Egyptian empire. I mean, Israel was just a little corner of Egypt. It covered everything from Libya up to Syria. Occasionally, it sort of shrunk down to the Nile, but the original center was at Jericho. So all the dates add up. It's exactly as Plato said. 9,000 BC was when they had the battle. 8,000 BC is when Egypt finally got sorted out. Because these things take hundreds of years. I mean, we're talking skirmishes. We're not talking like spaceships in here. Yeah, we're talking people walking. And this is another epiphany. When I realized everything they're describing really takes place in the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, these things were repeated around the world. These are patterns that we learn. I mean, history. Sorry.
So this is a point because a lot of people point to the reference to the Pillars of Hercules, and that this is the gap of Gibraltar. The gap between southern Spain and North Africa.
Yeah, but by sort of 200 BC it was. That's because the Athenians had been expanding. If you look at the earlier text, they're very clear that, basically there were lots of Pillars of Hercules. I mean, more specifically, the actual word is stela. It's like it's a memorial, a stone with writing on, not actually a pillar. And what would happen is whenever the Greeks would conquer somewhere, they'd put a stone down and say, we've been here. Hercules has been here. Because Hercules was the symbol of Greece, the symbol of Greek power. If you look at the stories, wherever Hercules was, that's where Greece was. When they defeat a nation, they stick some pillars there. It's like this stela, rather, stones with writing on, saying that we've been here. And there's examples of Pillars of Hercules in the east, in the south, and the west. In the particular time of Plato, it's pretty clear that they were around Tunisia, because, and especially before the seas rose, there were a lot more islands, and it was very much the Eastern Mediterranean was like enclosed. I mean, it wasn't completely enclosed, It was rather like the North Sea, it's kind of enclosed by Britain and Europe. I mean, you can, big gaps, The Mediterranean, as Plato talks about, the Mediterranean Sea, which is the bit between sort of Sardinia and Italy, it felt like it was enclosed. There's so many islands around, and that was their world. So the Pillars of Hercules until about 400 BC were around Sicily, and then there's expanded further west. All the myths, and you trace the myths, and the myths will first of all place things really locally, and then 100 years later, the version of it places it further away. And eventually the Pillars of Hercules sort of travel all the way up to Europe until they're up in the lands of the cold north. It's quite funny. I trace it in my book. They're very, very clear. These things expand. They move because it represents the edge of their known world, the edge of the world they felt comfortable with.
Right.
Sorry?
That's another one because Plato mentions the area of, is it Libya? Does he reference that Atlantis is the size of Libya or something like that? And am I right?
Well, yeah. He says it's larger than Libya and Asia. Combined.
He says Asia, doesn't he? But at the time, Asia would have just been sort of Western Anatolia to the Greeks.
Exactly. Yes, we've got to use words as they mean them, as they use them.
Right.
I mean, in particular, everything's about Atlas. That's something I just discovered last week. I wish I'd put it in my book. the Berbers, who were the original people of the Sahara, I mean, they're the ones you should go to on the real story of Atlas and Atlantis and the rest of it. All these words, in case anyone isn't following this. Atlas, Atlas is the base word for Atlantis, means daughter of Atlas. Atlantic, which is the sea of Atlas. Atlantia, which is the land of Atlas. Anything with Atlan in it, it just means Atlas. It just means this land, the original land. Anyway, and the people who lived there originally, a bit further away than the Greeks knew, really, further away to the west, i.e. just past Libya, i.e. Tunisia and onwards. And as they expanded, they kind of conquered that area, and so then it meant past the, into the Atlantic Ocean as we know it. But back then, you've got to use the words as they use it. As you say, Asia to them meant Asia Minor, which meant Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Libya meant the northern part of Africa, pretty much the whole northern between Egypt and the mountains. And it came to mean pretty much as everything. You've got to use the words as they use them. That's why, what was I saying? Last week, the Berbers spoke of Atlas as the king of Mauritania. Now, Mauritania is the gap between the Atlas Mountains and the anti-Atlas Mountains, i.e. the west coast, i.e. near to the Rikat structure. And but from the 9th century, and I suspect long before that, they used to call this the island of the West, because it was a gap between the mountains. It's a reminder that their concept of island wasn't our concept of island. When they use the word island, they just mean a place you go to over water. And since they didn't have many ocean-going vessels, a river and the coastline weren't that much different. In fact, conceptually, they saw all the rivers and all the coastlines being part of the same world ocean. They have this sort of concept of the water sort of spreading out and then sort of recirculating. It's all the same thing to them. An island just meant anything you had to cross water. And the example of the Mauritania, I mean, today it's a desert. And it would have been a desert back then too, but they called it an island because it was separated. You had to go over water to get to it. I mean, you could walk across the desert to get there, but only an idiot would do that. It's much quicker just go around the coast. An island, you meant anything you cross water. And so it refers to that area of desert as the island of Meroe was a famous, the capital of Nubia.
Yeah.
Nubia
would be south of Egypt, wouldn't it?
That's right. Yes.
Numidia would be would be more sort of what they would call Libya, wouldn't it? The first Numidian cavalry the Romans had.
Yeah.
The point is, the capital of Nubia is called the island of Meroe, and we wouldn't call it an island today because now we're thinking of an ocean with like loads and loads of water. All they meant was you had to go across water to get there. In the particular case of Meroe, it's where the River Nile splits into two, so you've got to go across water to get to Meroe. And so it's the island of Meroe. You've got to use their words. We can't use the modern words for it. I mean, it's like in the Bible when people say the whole world was flooded and we think of the planet. Now, the whole world to them was, could have been only 20 miles in any direction. I mean, if you're flooded, it doesn't matter.
How's this sort of like the climate change from the Younger Dryas affect the story when it comes to this Atlas region and where the Atlanteans were living?
Well, well, that's what caused the people, we call them today the Ibero-Mauritians. Basically, they were the Atlanteans, the people of Atlas, people of the Atlas Mountains. That's what caused them to move eastward, because the weather had changed and it was drying up a bit. And so that's why they attacked Egypt.
Right, so they were forced east due to the Younger Dryas.
Yeah, because the great thing about Egypt is the Nile always runs. This is why Egypt has the oldest records. Because Plato talks about this. Everywhere else, every sort of few thousand years, something will go wrong. Whereas the Nile, it's always there. Whether it's good, it's bad, indifferent, every single year, you always get the floods, you always get the nice soil, you always got water. So whatever happens, you can go to the Nile and you always have a bit of life. It's wonderful. It really is. Yes, that's what caused it to happen. As far as Plato's version, and again, I have to say, these are patterns. We have crises and floods and asteroids and you name it. Things happen. So this kind of pattern will happen. And I'm totally in favour of people who say, that there is a circular place in America or there's a circular place on an island, and they were destroyed by a flood as well. Yes, these things happen.
That was something I was going to ask you. Really, what you thought? Have you looked into the Azores story of Atlantis? Whether there is anything there in that?
I trust the people who make it. I mean, I'm sure they're not lying to us. Because if you've got a maritime civilization, certainly back then. Today it's different because today you've got airplanes and you've got explosives and so on. So that makes a different you build things differently today. But thousands of years ago, you would build a circle. You look for something circular that's easier to defend. So wherever there's a circle, you'll find people, and you'll find that they use it as a fortress. I mean, this is why the Richat structure. I mean, it has to be a fortress, because those people every 5,000 years or so, when they had a wet Sahara period, that was just teeming with people, and this was a natural fortress. So of course they'd use it as a fortress, and it has rivers going everywhere, particularly the Tamanrasset, linking it to the northern part of Africa. So obviously it's going to be full. You don't need to prove it. I mean, you need the onus on proof is to prove that people didn't use a natural fortress. It's like when I got badgers, I feed the badgers every day. Local badgers are wonderful. If I put the peanuts out and they're gone in the morning, I know the badgers have eaten it, and something's going to eat it. If you're going to prove to me that something magical has happened to the peanuts, you got to prove it to me, because I know if you put peanuts out there, something's going to eat it. Similarly, if you have a circular fortress, people are going to be there. It's very much like the 12,000 year cycle of history. When the scholars say that we didn't know about the 12,000 year cycle until like 200 BC, that's garbage. It's like saying we don't know there's 365 days in the year. As long as you've got a temple or any kind of permanent settlement, you're going to align it to the stars that arise in the spring, because that's when you want to harvest. And so you're going to have this thing narrowly pointed at the stars. And after 50 years, it's going to be in the wrong place. You're going to notice the stars have moved. Everybody's going to notice every time there's been a civilization, they're going to have shrines pointed at stars. And every time 50 or so years passes, i.e. one human lifetime, they're going to notice that the stars aren't where they used to be, because they'll have drawn them there. And they'll say, look between this channel and you will see the stars arise at the beginning of the year. And people are going to say, wait a minute, they're not quite in the right place. And then all you need is a stick in the ground. You draw a circle, because the stars always move in circles. And you think, well, it moved this much in 50 years. Another 50, another 50, another 50, 20,000, 30,000 years. You're not going to be precise. But everybody's going to know that it's going to take 20, 30,000 years to go all the way around, because it's moved that little bit in 50 years. So the onus of proof is on the scholars to prove that they didn't have these things. We don't have to claim that they had absolutely precise mathematics, which they may well have had.
I think sorry, Chris, I was just going to say, I think the thing that maybe scholars have problem with the long count, the precession of the equinox. Great, yeah, they knew this thing happened, but how is it relevant? That's probably what interests me more. Why is it relevant to them to sort of mark these things? And we get it through, we talk about the age of Aquarius, the age of Taurus. It all seems to tie in with theology as well, like the Old Testament and Egypt as well, the age of Aries. These sort of religious things seem to line up with these periods of the long count.
Yeah. I was thinking about that last week. I think it all comes down to what we are as physical humans. We are born every 25 years. A person can be born 25 years later on average. They can have kids, or 18, 25 years, whatever. Every 25 years or so, you've got a generation. And you've got a whole generation of people having new ideas, rejecting the old ideas. And that creates a cycle of 25 years. You've then got human life being 100 years. The oldest people were dead after 100 years. 100 years gives you human memory. So even though the kids have different ideas, they've got people around who can remember the past. So you've got a natural cycle of 25 years. You've got a natural cycle of 100 years. Now, I mentioned before about this 5,000 year cycle of we're living through an information revolution now. And there was another information revolution 5,000 years ago when we invented writing. And there's another information revolution 5,000 years before that, when we had the division of labor. Because for the first time, you have specialists, people who knew what other people did not know. And that was a huge information revolution. So that's a 5,000 year cycle. When you look at it, all these things are quite natural. I think this is what, Graham Hancock argues that there could have been, every 12,000 years, there could be bombardments from outer space.
Yeah.
Possibly. But if you look at Egyptian dates, the dates for their big changes, they only average 12,000 years or 20,000 years, whatever. Sometimes they're a lot shorter. Usually there's sort of 10,000 years-ish. Anyway, my thinking is it comes down to what we are as people. 25 years cycle of birth, of new ideas. 100-year cycle of everybody dying. So that's new ideas and take over. You've then got the memory of writing these things down. And then you've got the physical limit in your brain. Most people can remember about 100 friends. If you have more than 100 friends, you start to forget details. You can only keep track. This is why optimal size for a human tribe is 100 people, 50 people, 200 people. It depends. That's that kind of number, and I think that is the basis of why we forget things. You can remember history, but after about 500 years, you really you can't remember all the details. You can't remember every single king. If you look at our history, there's a 500-year cycle. Rome is a great example of that. 500 BC, the Roman Republic. 500 years later, they turned it into an empire. 500 years later, the Western Empire collapsed. Yeah. 500 years later, the popes became super powerful in Rome again. 500 years later, the Eastern Empire collapsed. 500 years later, we got today, and people are just rejecting Catholicism completely. It's like we can forget everything. It takes about 500 years we just can't hold that many people in our minds. And after 500 years, it becomes so fragile that the next natural disaster is enough to knock it down. So it comes to natural disasters. Natural disasters are why we have why we live a certain age. Because if you're a microbe, it's a much more dangerous world, and you've got to have a life cycle of like a day or 2 days. If you're a whale or a whale shark, you can maybe have a life cycle of 500 years. For us, because of the way we live, because our natural cycles, an environment makes our life cycle of 25 years optimal. And so the environment and disasters create this life cycle of humans living about 100 years, having children in, say, 25 years. And they also create the natural disasters that mean after you've sort of forgotten everything you used to know after 500 years, because you can't hold it in your head, then you're weak, then the next disaster will knock you down, and the next civilization will arise. So what my argument is, there's a 25-year cycle, there's a 100-year cycle, there's a 500-year cycle, there's a 2,500-year cycle, which I suspect is to do the same thing. You can remember stuff, you can remember sort of patterns, but you can't remember everything. Like in the Bible, 500 years BC. 500 BC is when the Bible, as we know it, was created, when they had a canon. And there's a real difference in the Bible. After 500 BC, they're all settled, they've got kings, and they're monotheist. Before 500 BC, they're all roving shepherds and they're polytheists. And the monotheists try to argue that really they were monotheists all along because they couldn't really cope with the idea of being different. But this big change, 2,500 years, and you can sort of remember the previous one, but before the previous one, they're totally lost. Before 3000 BC, 2,500 years before they had the Bible, that's when you got the invention of writing. And before that, they're really, really vague. They get a sort of vague story of Adam and Eve, but they're really vagueness. We can only hold a certain amount in our brain. Anyway, that's what I'm getting to. I think it's down to the human body and cycles. 25 years, 100 years, 500 years, 2,500 years, 5,000 years, then 10,000 years. By 10,000 years, you can't remember anything. We've totally lost it. We're very, very weak. Whatever it was that built us up to be what we are, we've forgotten it all with idiots. And then that's what the Hindus say. We have this patterns, this cycle where we forget, and it becomes harder and harder, and we go down, and then we change, and we start again, and go up again, and down again. And I think that's just my personal theory. It's all based on how we can only remember 100 people, and how you try and make sense of the past. Now you have these patterns, these institutions, and eventually it just becomes too much to remember. And you change it and pretend it hasn't changed, and eventually, after 10,000 years, that's as much as we can cope with. So the next disaster comes along, we just crap, and we'll start again.
Who was the psychologist?
Oh, I knew you were going to say that.
We went to watch his lecture, and he came up with this theory of how many faces you can keep to a name. It's Robin something.
Dr.
Robin.
Do you know it, Chris?
I don't know the name, no, but that's very much what I'm arguing. Yes,
there is a psychological theory for it. Basically, he's an evolutionary psychologist, and I think is it like 120, 125, something like that.
It varies, and it's stratified, isn't it? There are certain rings, so you can have a main ring, which will be like your immediate familial connections, and then like a couple of outer rings, and you only have room for so many. So if you make some new friends, you're going to lose a couple. You're going to lose some brain room.
Yeah, I think that's the base of these 10,000-year cycles. I think that their averages, their just experience tells us, and because that fits in so neatly with the 25,000-year star cycle, it's just the natural way to measure it.
Something I wanted to ask you, sort of just on a tangent, while you were talking about the human, how we seem to be, our life cycle is determined by our environment. And you just made me think, because I know, you've done a lot of Old Testament sort of reading due to your background and that. What do you make of like the age of the patriarchs and why, Methuselah and Isaac and how they lived so long. What's going on there?
Well, then that's a great example of what I mean. Before the 2,500 year cycle, we can kind of, the religion as we have it today is pretty much the same as it's been for the last 2,500 years. It was 500 BC, the axial period. It was when everything changed in the world. And that's when they wrote the Bible. And so we kind of understand this way of doing it with kings and with rules, and the Bible being an instruction book. Before that, it wasn't. Now, yes, Methuselah and so on, they come from the previous period. In fact, they're the previous period before that. You got our 2,500 years when you've got a written Bible that's our instruction book. You got 2,500 years before that, back to 3000 BC when you had writing. And then before that, you got oral history. And that's when it's just more than we can cope with. Now, if you look at Genesis 5, where these numbers were, every single name is a description. I mean, the way I first realized this was, if this was genuine, they could not have written it down word for word because the writing didn't exist. And there's so many patterns. It's the same pattern every time. It says, so-and-so had lived so-and-so many years and had sons and daughters, and then lived so many years and died. Then his son lived for so many years, had sons and daughters, for so many years, and he died. I thought, they're not writing this down. That's how we write it now. To be written down, that would have been written as name, number, name, number, name, number. And the rest of it, that's a memory aid. It had to be that way. And these aren't names, they're actually descriptions. Now, Adam, this means the people of the soil, the red soil. Methuselah means the people of the spear. Noah means the people of rest. They're descriptions. And if you look at the history of ancient Sumer, the dates match up. The periods they're talking about, they're describing the history of Sumer. And it's amazing. Every single date matches up perfectly. I've got an appendix in the book that goes into this.
So it matches up with like the evolution of Sumerian civilization from hunter-gatherers. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
That's wild.
4000 BC is the critical time, because that's when the Ubaid culture became the Sumerian culture. The Ubaid culture was a nice place to live. They had like multi-story houses. I mean, not like 10 stories, but I mean, yeah, they had different floors, decent houses. They had lovely art, they had trade, nice place to live, very, very flat structure. They had kings, but your king, the difference between the king and the commoner wasn't very much. And it was really nice. Then a crisis hit because of the climate change. I can't remember this one. Again, these cycles, they all combine. You get the 8,000 year cycle, the 5,000 year cycle. I'd love to go into this. So many things I'd love to go into. But yeah, one of these crises hit 4,000 BC. And that's when the king said, right, this is our opportunity. And that's when they took extra power. And that's when they invented cities. They said, right, we are now on top. They started building these great big towers, literally towers, and the king will be at the top and say, right, I represent the gods. I speak to the gods. You obey me. And this carried on, and then they invented writing, and that enabled the system to expand massively. Because once you got writing, you can send instructions hundreds and hundreds of miles. And you can you seem like you're a god because you have all this knowledge, so it seems.
And it involves the invention of property as well. You need to be able to write down and record who owns what, i.e. the king owns everything and you don't.
Yeah. I mean, that is why they invented writing. 3000 BC, the temples became so wealthy. If you look at the different kinds of writing, they had this thing where they put a clay ball, I forget what they call them now, and they put a little object to represent everything that they owned and stick it inside this clay ball. And that worked for a while, but they found cuneiform worked better. So there's various, and the problem was they had too much money. They got so wealthy, about 3000 BC, they had to find a way to list everything that's coming into the temple, because the temple was getting all this gold and silver, and they had to keep track of it. And that's how they invented writing.
And then high priest and king is probably pretty much synonymous in this period.
Yes, yeah. I mean, eventually they had to separate them because it became really obvious that kings made mistakes. You need plausible deniability. You've got to blame high priest, and high priest has to blame the king. It works together. So it's like, not my fault, governor. So I seem to have failed. I haven't really failed. That's the other guy.
Wow.
But yeah, the dates do match up though. 3000 BC is a critical time. That's when you invent writing, and that's when they have Enoch. Enoch is about the guy who knew things. He knew writing. He was able to write things down and remember things. And all these ages, I used to wonder in the Bible, why is it all these people live for 900 years? Look closer, it's not that they live 900 years. It's that everything points to 3000 BC, and everything changed around 3000 BC. Mm-hmm. Anyway, yeah, it's all in my book. Because we're looking back, the way we think of it, we're thinking of these people as being literal individual people with sort of two arms and two legs. We find it difficult to think of them as periods of time, as cultures, because the way of thinking has changed every couple of thousand years. It's just our way of seeing religion changes. I mean, recently religion changed as well. This idea of religion being about belief, that's a modern idea. You know, it didn't used to be religion, just meant culture. You know, the ancient Jews didn't matter what you believed. Moses never asked you to believe anything. He just wants you to perform certain sacrifices to prove that to show that you were part of the team and you were working on the same page. You know, totally different ideas of religion, different ideas of history. You know, we can only hold so much in our heads, and that's the problem. The Genesis chapter 5 is before 3000 BC. This is 2,500 year cycles ago. You know, we can kind of make sense of what happened 2,500, from 3000 BC to 500 BC. That's like Genesis, Exodus, and so on. But before that, we really have trouble. We have come up with stupid ideas, you know, that Methuselah was an actual individual person, lived 969 years. Oops, well, my alarm's going off telling me to water the plants.
That happened last time, didn't it?
Yeah, it did, yeah. Something else you mentioned in your email was about our DNA, something about the story of Atlantis maybe being written in our DNA. What was that?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what I was just saying about the cycles. The reason we have this 25-year cycle is because our DNA says, you know, you're going to have kids. It's like, well, you hit a certain age, like sort of 13 to 14, 15, as a sort of typical male, heterosexual male anyway, and suddenly women become really, really interesting to you. You know, and naked women become even more interesting. And you have this sort of drive, this sort of, I must get a woman, must be naked, must do anything for this. That's our DNA. It's forcing this cycle. And it's because of the cycle, then we have conflict. And then we want to expand and spread and want to own things. And all this human stuff, it's all written in our DNA. And that's why we expand. And simply our DNA makes our brain a certain size so we can have our 125 friends, you know, give or take. And that's why we can remember history now. We're pretty good at history for 500 years, so for 2,500 years, barely manage it for 5,000 years. And after that, we're really starting to geese us. After 10,000 years, forget it, you know. And the slightest breath of wind is going to knock over our entire civilization because we just don't know what we're doing after a while.
You found it, Matt. It's Dunbar's number.
Dunbar's number, yeah. 150, it says.
Robin Dunbar.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, that's what my argument is. And that's why you'll find Atlantis all over the world. Even if you didn't have any writing, no history, you can reconstruct it because you know that we want to spread out because of our DNA. You know that we want to defend ourselves. You know, because we live in a two-dimensional surface on the planet, we're going to have circles to defend ourselves because it's the most efficient way. It's the smallest area to defend. So you're going to tend to get or harbours and circles, which are like the basis of Atlantis. And the ideal harbour was circles within circles within circles. I mean, for example, I used to live near some hill forts in England. I don't know where it was now. God, I was born in Rugeley, Staffordshire. There's various hill forts anyway. And the point is, it's just natural. You'd have concentric circles. It wasn't that they were copying somebody else. This is just the natural way of the way people live. You know, and then you get proud and rich and cocky, and you overextend yourself, and then something happens, and you all collapse. You know, that is the story of Atlantis. Now we get specific stories of Atlantis, the one that Plato told, and I mean, I like to to trace it. The Phoenicians, I like to trace it from Carthage back to Tyre, back to Sidon, back to Tunisia, back to the Rickard structure, but it was happening everywhere. It will always happen because of our DNA. Because our DNA means we want to have kids, we want to have friends, we want to make these networks, we want to expand, we will overextend ourselves. The cycle will happen again and again and again and again. And this is the beauty of mythology, because once you get past sort of 5,000 years, it's not practical to remember every detail. You can't remember every king and every battle and every this and every that. It's just ridiculous. But you can remember the cycles. And you can remember particular ones that are really interesting. Sort of the text example. And the text of an Atlantis situation was 9,000 BC, when they invaded Egypt and got driven back. And the text of Atlantis, it is that particular Atlantis, but there are many Atlantises. So that's why I say I'm very happy if the Azores has a circular harbour, and if they invaded somewhere and they got pushed back and they collapsed because of some natural disaster. Yeah, I can very much believe that happens. It's written in our DNA. It's written in the soil. It's written in the environment. These are the patterns the ancient people noticed. And we forget these patterns because we can't see past 5,000 years. We only understand writing on paper. They understood writing in the stars. They understood writing inside you. They understood the writing in the ground, the evidence on the ground, the archaeology.
What's the text? Is that does that derive from Mesopotamia or of the Chaldees?
Yeah. Just the phrases means the original text, like of the Chaldees, where Abraham came from. It's like the original ancient one. I discovered the original city where all life came from. So when we talk about Atlantis, we generally mean the one that Plato just spoke about. But like I say, I'm perfectly happy to talk about other Atlantides, the plural of Atlantis, other daughters of Atlas, because we all came out of Africa. We're all daughters of Atlas. Britain is a daughter of Atlas. Ultimately, it's a few generations. I mean, the Iliad, for example, it's called the Iliad. It's like the Pleiades and the Hyades. It means it's female. And if you actually look at Troy, I mentioned, is the great grandson of Electra, who was the daughter of Atlas. So Troy is a kind of distant daughter of Atlas. We're all daughters of Atlas. We're all Atlantes. Wow. We have specific examples, but these are patterns. We need to learn these patterns because it's going to happen again. I mean, it's happening now, right? The Western civilization in particular has become very, very powerful, overextended, conquered the whole world, become very lazy, very corrupt. And so it'll only take a bit of climate change or something, and something will happen, and we won't be able to survive. We'll start killing each other, and the Chinese will come in and say, ha, 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 it's our turn now. We need to learn these patterns because it happens again and again and again. It's written in.
That's something we've come back to again and again, is that our civilization is quite kind of on a knife edge because we're so reliant on things like electric. I mean, it's like you say, just knock the power off for 2 weeks and see what's left of our civilization. Nothing.
Yeah, that's right. We've made ourselves fragile because we're so proud.
Yeah.
Whereas humble ones take a lot more care and don't overextend themselves if something happens, or they can cope with it. Yeah. I mentioned. Sorry.
I was just going to say, Chris, because we're coming up to an hour already. I don't want you to feel like you've missed anything. That you wanted, that was burning, that you wanted to get out there. I'm not trying to rush you or anything. I'm just aware of the time.
I've got so much else I need to get done anyway. Yeah, I just wanted to mention.
And don't forget to water your plants either.
Yes. I don't think I'm hungry again. A few other examples of Atlantis. Okay, we mentioned Herodotus briefly. Because he says what the Atlanteans are. He tells you exactly where they are in Tunisia in his day. Ancient maps of Atlantis, in my book I mentioned the oldest maps we know, is like they're pointing to the Rikat structure. The way that they're drawn, and the Rikat structure, they describe it as being the chariot of the gods, and they call it the African hippodrome, which is just how Plato described it, as having these races, these massive races that all Africa would come to. And again, this is a natural thing for humans to do. We like to race. So I can quite believe if there's an Atlantis in the Azores, they also would have had races around there, assuming it's above, using whatever animals they had. These are just natural patterns. Maps of Atlantis, Hesiod's Atlantis. Again, well, that's the Titanomachy. If you look at the story of the Titans versus the gods, the Titans were led by Atlas, again, King Atlas. The trigger was when they invaded Egypt, and then they got driven to the west. So it's the same story. Homer's Atlantis, Homer's Atlantis, the Odyssey. The Odyssey is all about getting home from Atlantis. It begins, remember, Odysseus is in the island of Calypso. Calypso was the daughter of Atlas. One of the later Greek versions even just calls her Atlantis, because Atlantis means daughter of Atlas. And the ancient Greeks reckoned it was sources. It was in a city of the island Gozo, which is between Tunisia and Sicily. So again, they knew it was very, very close to the Tunisia. I mean, my argument is that the particular Atlantis that Plato was talking about has to be in Tunisia. But also, this was modelled on the natural harbours they had back in the Ritat structure. And it then became the model for the other... anyway, yes, Carthage and Tyre and Sidon. There are multiple examples of this.
They're the Phoenician cities of the ancient world.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Yes, the seafarers. These patterns happen again and again.
What about Jason and the Argonauts? Does that tie in that story?
Very much so. Yes. Yeah, because if you remember the Jason and the Argonauts, they are trying to get to Lake Tritonis, which was the Great Lake, because the prophecy was if they control Lake Tritonis, they basically control the world. And Lake Tritonis used to be a lot bigger. This was the lake or the sea of Atlas.
Next to the Rikat structure.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's at the top, but it leads down the Tamanrasset, the great river, which is, if you join Africa and America together, where South America has the Amazon, Africa has the Timaeus. Basically, it's like the same river. Obviously, there are millions of years and they're separated now. But that's the easy way to remember where the Timaeus goes. Right. The Timaeus takes you from the Rikat structure up to the Atlas Mountains, up to the Lake Tritonis, the Sea of Atlas. And it's very important that Plato calls it the Sea of Atlas. He doesn't call it the ocean. The ocean is a general name for all salt water. But he specifically calls it the Sea of Atlas. And that's what the locals called the Lake Tritonis, which now is just like it's dried up after the year. It's a tiny little thing. But it used to be huge, yeah. And it would lead you via the mighty Timaeus River down to the Richat structure, and then out to wherever.
Can I ask you a question quickly before it disappears off the chat? David's just asking, can we ask Chris for citations for the drifting Pillars of Hercules, the drifting west?
Yes.
Where would we find out that from?
That is in appendix, whatever it is, appendix 4 of Jack Kirby's History. Jack Kirby's History of the Future. All the footnotes are there.
There'll be a link in the show notes, David, and you can download it for free, a digital copy. So
yes.
Not yourself out.
The one about Atlantis, the moving one, that's kind of important. That's the one where I really make the argument for it being Tunisia. But in this podcast, I just want to make clear that I think that had to be one. Because I used to think you talk about the Rikat structure. And I've got a website about arguing to the Rikat structure, but when I wrote the book, I thought I just want to tie up some loose ends. I was reading a lot more of the older sources, and it was very obvious. Like, you're asking about Jason and the Argonauts, and I got distracted. Yeah, they had to go to the Lake Tritonis because whoever owned the Lake Tritonis then controlled the world. And when they got there, they found it was covered with mud because it had dried up. It describes it exactly the same way Plato describes it. It's the same place.
Yeah, the sea covered in mud, and it made it impenetrable, didn't it?
Yes. Yes, so they had to carry their boat across it in order to get to the remains of the lake.
Interesting.
One other example of Atlantis, the big one that even the critics have to admit, there was a book called Atlantis before Plato by, who wrote this now? Herky something. Hellanicus, that's right. We've only got one line from it exists now. It says, our Poseidon coupled with the Slicko and their son Lycus settled by blah, blah, blah. Basically, he's saying, in the Hellanicus' story called Atlantis, daughter of Atlas, written 100 years before Plato. The only line we've got is just about how Poseidon coupled with Slicko, which was one of the daughters of Atlas, and their son Lycus settled. Blah, 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 blah. What he's arguing in that one line is that Poseidon basically raped Athens because Slicko was the daughter of Atlas who lived in Athens. So he raped them, and their son then had to go west. Now that's all the Greeks knew about it until Solon, when they found what was this rape? Why did the son go west? And the Egyptians had the whole story. So you don't know that half of it. You don't know this story. This is amazing. And that line also is quoted by Apollodorus as well. It's not just Hellanicus. But anyway, the point is there is a book called Atlantis that existed before Plato. I mean, how they can say it didn't exist, and they say it doesn't exist because the scholars try to claim that King Atlas, and the Titan Atlas were different people, whereas all the sources say they were the same person. The Berbers say they were the same. I guess some examples here. There's a lot of evidence anyway. They are the same. Yeah. So Plato's described it as an epic poem. Anyway, so I need another hour to go into this, but they're the same person.
Yeah.
And just to summarize, the Plato 330 BC, Hellanicus 400 BC, his book about Atlas, Herodotus 400 BC about where Atlantis was. The ancient maps of Atlantis, they were from what recent, like the one by Mercator, but he was using very, very ancient sources, and they're the ones that really emphasize the Richat structure. That's all about this in my book. Homer's Atlantis, 1000 BC, but the Odyssey is about getting home from Atlantis. The Egyptian Atlantis, 1300 BC and before, which is basically the same story. Archaeology confirms it. It's written in the sky. Yeah, if I had more time, I'd go, it's fascinating. All the stars tell the story. The dates, the places, everything's in the stars. It's just amazing.
I've got a couple more. Sorry, go on, Chris.
No, that's it. That's all I want to cover. Those are the main sources before Plato.
It seems that a lot of these civilizational foundation myths incorporate this story. I wondered if you'd done any work on Virgil's Aeneid and the Roman foundation story, and whether there was any correlates there.
I haven't done it yet. No, because that's written after Plato. So I'm like, okay, you could argue that these are too influenced by him. And I just wanted to stick this up before Plato, so we can get Plato out of the way. The entire story of there. If you put in the Titanomachy, combine the Titanomachy, basically everything about Atlas or everything about Egypt getting invaded from the west and saved from people from the Athenians. It's all the same story. Put it together, you've got Plato's story.
Right.
Yeah, it was after that. There's so much to learn. That's the thing. I mean, now having said that, if I had more time, I'd go into it, and I could bet next week I'll be like, wow, I never knew this. I wish I'd said that. There's so much out there. And it drives me crazy that the scholars won't even admit the connection. They won't even admit that King Atlas was the Titan Atlas. Because if they admit that, they have to admit that their whole purpose for existing, a scholar, the whole reason for having universities is to make people work. And the reason that there was a time before 10,000 BC when we didn't have to work. Certainly not like we work now. And they can't admit that.
Is that a modern thing, or did when Plato set up his famous academy? Did they have a different philosophy then? Do you think? Is this a modern thing over the last 100 years about universities?
Universities as you have them now are only a couple of hundred years old. I write about this in my book about the invention of the Stone Age. It was always known as the Golden Age until we had the dark satanic mills, and life got pretty awful for most people in Europe. And then they were going around conquering everybody. And there's the famous case of a mutiny on the Bounty. The sailors got to Tahiti, and there's all these naked women who were just happy and relaxed and having a lovely life. And they thought, we're the advanced ones. So it was after that the greatest scholars in the world at the time were in Paris, and they had a competition and said, you've got to come up with an explanation of why we're better than these people. Please, somebody do it. And so they basically invented the idea of the Stone Age. People were really primitive. They only look happy. Okay, they just eat fish and play in the sand all day and have sex and so on. But they're not really happy. Not like us. Not like you workers. You slaves who have to work on board ships and press ganged, and a horrible, horrible life for the average person in Europe. And they had to persuade them somehow that life was even worse back in the past. And that's why they invented the Stone Age.
One more question, Chris, and this is a bit off topic, but are you familiar with nubs?
Nubs?
Yeah, on ancient structures, these sort of protrusions.
Masonry nubs.
Yeah, that sort of appear on all sorts of...
Lifting up things. So you lift, the idea is that you hold a stone and lift it up by the nubs, is that right?
I think that's the sort of mainstream explanation.
Yeah, again, I don't know that. That's all I've heard.
That's all right. That's what one of our nub experts, Ziggy Dan.
The nub expert.
Yes, the nub expert, Ziggy Dan, wanted your opinion, but it's something you should look into. They're interesting and somewhat... that sort of mainstream explanation doesn't seem to hold water with me. That they were for lifting purposes only.
I don't know stuff. This is the great thing about being an ex-Mormon. You realise how little you know. But then because I was so convinced I was right. And then you notice this same pattern everywhere. And you see, as scholars, they don't know any more than I do. Well, they know more in this narrow area, but it all falls apart because it's all based on a false foundation. For example, that we don't have any records from before 3000 BC. Well, actually, we got tons of them. Yeah. It's amazing how little we know. That's why I love Jack Kirby. He's very much so the only people, anybody who thinks he's got the answers, they're the one person you know who definitely hasn't. That's why I love your kind of show. It's like most of us are probably wrong, but heavens, we're professional wrong. We're humans. Humans are sort of wrong by design. we're bumbling through. So I don't know stuff. I'm just amazed how little I know, and it annoys me when people stand up and say, "I know stuff." Well, you don't actually. You have to scratch the surface to find out they're wrong.
Yeah, a good starting point is to realise that you know nothing and work from there.
Socrates, he was right.
You have to sort of catch yourself though, because I do it as well, and you sometimes assume to know things for certain, and I don't know what it is about our psyche that makes us want to do that. I don't know. Maybe it's an ego thing. Maybe.
Oh yeah,
Carl Jung would be able to explain it better than me.
I think it's the brain. I think the brain is a very unusual thing, and it has to come up with these crazy theories to defend itself and justify its existence. But that's very deep water, so I'm not going down there.
Is there anything you want to leave us with, or anything burning that you need to say before we wrap up? Because we're on an hour and 10 now.
Yeah, no, that's it. Hellanicus, Herodotus, Hesiod, Homer, lots of H's in there. Yeah,
Like
all
the
H's.
H blocks in Peru.
Yeah, all the H
Exactly.
blocks. And particularly this story of the heavenly cow, the destruction of mankind, which I go over that in my book.
Taurus, man. Heavenly cow. The leg of the bull.
Yeah.
That's the Pleiades, I think. The leg of the bull. Do you remember from Ryan 7?
Yeah.
It goes through all that.
Ryan, Jack Kirby, Ryan was his #1 hero. And you got Robert Bouval and the position of the pyramids, Orion's belt. It's all the same story.
Oh, it's a quick one. Another one from David. David Stig Hansen. Since he turns comments off, how can we interact with Chris? Oh, something about comments on YouTube and how can people get hold of you?
That's a problem, you see. I'm mildly autistic. I'm not sociable. I stress about stuff. I do apologize, but I spend hours. If somebody messages me, I'll spend that all day trying to think of an answer and researching it and getting tied up. And I do have a full-time job. And I've been working on this computer game for the last 25 years. Right, I've got to get it done. I've got to just stop doing this stuff. I only came on this podcast because I realized there's not much point publishing a book if no one ever reads it. I mean, I'm not looking for thousands of readers. I want that book, a few people to read it, so that if the stuff happens as I think it will, in 30 years' time, they can look back and say, oh, yeah, Jack Kirby said so. And if he doesn't, well, I'll be dead by then, so who cares?
Yeah. No, that's fair enough. I mean, you're not obliged to answer everyone's queries, you know. It's
I'd love
the way it is, isn't it? It's up to you.
Yeah, I cannot write a sentence without it taking me literally hours, and that's my whole day gone. Yeah. And that might be the only day of the week at a time, so I do apologise. Don't contact me.
I understand completely.
Actually, I'm not that difficult to find. My email address is easy to find. It wouldn't take hard. I'm on Facebook and so on. But yeah, I'm not a sociable person. I need to just what I love best is just blocking out the world, focusing on something, exploring it further and further and further and further. I love that.
Cool.
Well, people. Sorry.
Well, we'll wrap up, Chris? That's all right with you?
Yeah, thank you very much again for inviting me. I do.
No problem.
I'm grateful.
Love it, and we'd love to talk to you again. You know,
Yeah.
I love all the Old Testament stuff, and you know.
Oh yeah, that's another thing. I'm so frustrated people who reject the whole thing. I mean, obviously it's not an instruction book. It was never intended as an instruction book. It's a collection of books, some of which are crap, but some of which record some pretty darn interesting stuff.
Yeah.
But,
Good. Good, excellent. Right, well, thanks, Chris. We'll sign off for part 1.
Yeah.
Don't forget to check out the links in the show notes. It's all there, and you don't even have to buy the book. But obviously, if like me, you're worried about the impending end of civilization, you might want to grab a hard copy. That's all I'm going to say.
Yes.
Definitely. And I will have an updated version in 2026, a sort of I told you so version. And I will...
Nice. Right, okay. Thanks, Chris. We'll be back in for part 2 shortly.
Yes, stay on the line.
Cheers, Chris.
Cheers.
Thank you.
In a bit. Bye.